The Brazilian state of Minas Gerais, located in the southeastern portion of the country, is known for its coffee, lush jungles, and its natural beauty, as the numerous waterfalls and caves dotted throughout the state draw in large numbers of visitors to the region every year. These tourists seeking to see the state's natural splendor make up a large portion of some of the smaller cities' economies, like in the small city of Capitolio, a city of approximately 8,500 residents that reports that it sees an average of 5,000 tourists per day on weekends and up to 30,000 tourists per day on holidays. One of the main draws for tourists visiting the Capitolio region is the magnificent waterfalls that cascade from the cliffs above and into a nearby lake known as Lago de Furnas, or Lake Furnas. Lake Furnas is not a natural lake, but rather a reservoir for the Furnas Dam, Brazil's first large hydroelectric dam, which was constructed in 1957 in the canyon of the Grande River. The numerous waterfalls that cascade from the high cliff walls that surround many portions of the lake are popular sites for tourists to come take pictures, soak in the sights, and even swim around, and many locals charter tours to take the tourists to some of the most beautiful and breathtaking locations in their boats. These locally guided tours have remained an extremely popular activity with tourists, and these chartered boats regularly bring hundreds of visitors a day to these lush cliffside coves. On Saturday, January 8th, 2022, it was just another day of business as usual for the local tour guides on Lake Furnas, as they'd have their hands full catering to the tourists that had come to visit the Capitolio region for the weekend. Over the last few weeks, the region had been drenched by a large amount of rainfall, and the tour boat operators and visitors alike were eager to take advantage of a relatively clear weather forecast that was expected for the day. And so, by the late morning, most of these tour boats had been filled and had begun to ferry their passengers to the various waterfalls located in Lake Furnas. Several of these chartered boats headed for a notoriously gorgeous cove located in a remote portion of the lake. This inlet was a Y shape surrounded on its edges by large 66-foot cliffs with a striking waterfall that cut through the rocks near the center of one of the Y's prongs, spilling water into it from above. By noon, several boats had reached the inlet with approximately 70 to 100 people populating the site aboard the vessels. As they usually did, many of the tour boats approached the waterfall in order to give their passengers the most breathtaking and intimate view of the surrounding nature, along with giving their passengers the best opportunities for capturing striking photos as well. However, this serene inlet tucked into Lake Furnas would soon after become a site of chaos, fear, and disaster, as the unsuspecting boaters would soon face a sudden, unforeseen tragedy that would alter their lives forever. At approximately 12:30 p.m., suddenly and seemingly without warning, a large pillar of rock broke from the cliffs surrounding the inlet and came crashing down atop several of the boats who had mere seconds to attempt to maneuver away from the crumbling cliffside. In footage taken by a passenger of one of the boats in the inlet, one of the vessels, its bow facing the now collapsing section of rock, can be seen being struck directly by the column of falling rock as another nearby boat attempts to flee away from it, traveling at a high rate of speed. In the immediate aftermath of the collapse, the small inlet was enveloped in chaos as the boats that had not been struck by the collapsing rock scrambled to search the now extremely murky waters for injured and dead, and all while accounting for their own passengers as well. As word of the disaster spread, the Brazilian government quickly organized a search and rescue operation, dispatching firefighters, the Air Operations Battalion, along with rescue divers and an additional 40 soldiers to assist in the effort, and aircraft were dispatched to aid them in their search from above. By the evening of the 8th, 7 people had been confirmed dead, with an estimate of approximately 30 injured and several more people still missing, and 2 of the 4 boats that had been struck by the falling rock had entirely sunk. By 5 a.m. the following morning, the death count had increased to 10 people killed, with 2 passengers still being unaccounted for. In the following days, the number of individuals reported as missing varied from outlet to outlet, but the death toll would remain steady at 10. Many of the deceased were said to have been unrecognizable due to the blunt force trauma from the impact of such a massive slab of rock, and authorities would take several days to identify the individuals that had perished in the disaster. Ultimately, the final death toll of the incident was reported to be 10 people dead and 32 people injured in the collapse. In wake of the disaster, an investigation into the cause of the collapse was initiated by the Brazilian Navy. The inquiry into the incident soon began to focus on the most obvious factor that likely contributed to the series of events that unfolded that fateful afternoon: the large amount of rainfall that had drenched the region in the previous weeks. It was found that on the morning of January 8th, the Civil Defense of Minas Gerais issued a warning regarding the heavy rains, urging the public to stay away from waterfalls during the rainy season. It was found that this warning had been received and disregarded by several of the tour boat operators before they had reached their destination that day, but it could not be determined with certainty whether all of the operators of the tour boats that were present were aware of this warning. The investigation further noted that the cliffside, which was composed of sedimentary rocks that tend to be more prone to structural weakening and erosion, was likely to collapse soon regardless of the heavy rainfall, but also noted that the rainfall had certainly served to expedite the process. The investigation also theorized that the collapse could have been triggered by a fair weather waterspout, which is essentially a tornado that forms over water. Fair weather waterspouts typically are fairly stationary and form on the surface of the water, moving upwards. The investigation theorized that this phenomenon could have possibly triggered the rockfall, but it could not be definitely determined whether this was the actual trigger of the collapse. The investigation noted that the way the chunk of the cliffside collapsed was quite abnormal, which had aggravated the severity of the disaster. According to the fire department spokesperson, Pedro Aihara, quote, "Another situation that unfortunately ended up aggravating was because the rock falls on a perpendicular path. Generally, when we have a rupture due to toppling, the rock comes out in a more sliced way. It flows through the structure and falls in a diagonal way, or else, in this case, as we had this perpendicular tipping, and due to the size of the rock, we ended up having these people directly affected." Ultimately, the investigation concluded that the event had been caused by erosion of the cliffside that had been accelerated by the heavy rainfall in the previous weeks. The report also concluded that the tour boats had acted recklessly by bringing the tourists so close to the waterfall, as it was determined that in order to maintain a safe distance from the collapse, the boats would have to maintain a distance of 1 kilometer from the cove, which the tour boats clearly did not do, despite some of them having heard the warnings against traveling to the waterfalls. In wake of these findings, the Brazilian government faced some international scrutiny as they were criticized for not patrolling the cliffsides along Lake Furnas more diligently, as it was widely known to be an area that was frequented by tourists who would not be aware of the hazards involved with visiting these picturesque waterfalls and inlets along the cliffsides during the rainy season. Following this disaster, the tourist pleasure cruising boats began to better maintain their distance from areas that could present a similar danger of collapse when approached, and the area is now under much stricter surveillance by government officials to ensure that the charter boats continue to maintain their distance from the cliff sides. Thank you all for watching.